move on now to our keynote speaker today, who is Don Visco. Don is an alumnus of the department who got both his undergraduate and graduate degrees here in the 90s. As you've seen the past couple of years, we've been bringing in alumni who've had very successful careers in different areas. And so Don was the first one we brought in who pursued an academic career, which I know is of interest to some of you. So I'll keep the introduction pretty short because I think he's going to have a lot of introduction in it. But basically, Don has been very successful both in the research and the education and administration sides of the academic career. Published prolifically and gotten lots of grants, over $8 million in grants over the years. Very active in the engineering education community. He's the editor of the Journal of Chemical Engineering Education, and is also a fellow of the American Society for Engineering Education. He started his career at Tennessee Tech, later moved to the University of Akron in Ohio as an associate dean, and then later became dean there. And now he's done deaning and is back to just being a regular professor and running his research group and teaching and so on. He's going to tell you all this key secrets for having a successful career like him.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. So, I wanted to talk today about the design of corrosion inhibitors for use in reinforced concrete. So corrosion impact, there's about 50 billion each year. No, of course I'm not going to talk about this, but I was wondering, like, what's he talking about up there? But no, so I'm really, pleased to talk about the academic pathway, perspectives along my journey, and one of the things about being a faculty member is I've written this sort of presentation once Mark made the offer many times in my head, doing different things, but of course, as a faculty member, you have that proposal to write, you have that homework to grade, you have that exam to prepare, you have to, do all these emails, you have questions from administration. So all these things kind of get in the way, and so this is what we have today, and I think every, faculty members realize there's kind of the things you wanted to do and then things that you end up presenting. So I struggled a little bit with how to put this together. My hope is that this is valuable to those in the audience that are, thinking about an academic career. So try to talk about it through my pathway. Thank you certainly to Mark for inviting me here today. It's really an honor for me to be here speaking with you. So today's presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got to UB, right? Because all of you, the students here, you're here at UB, so how did I get here? Some career highlights in my pathway, and ultimately, lessons learned along the way in my academic career. So how did I get to UB? So I want to talk a little bit about family, right? So this person here, this is my father. You can see he was in the Navy. This is my grandfather. He was born in 1904. His father is up here. He emigrated to the United States from Patina. It's a town outside of Naples in Italy, a very small town. He was born in 1880. I think he came about 1900. And this is Giovanni from about, he was born about 1850 or so. They were people that came to the United States. They worked as barbers. They worked as street cleaners, as you can kind of see a little bit up here. They worked as bricklayers, things like that. So me, here's some general information. I was born in Queens, so I sometimes tend to fall into my New York accent accidentally. So if I ever say, I'll say things like vecta and water in class, and then have to stop like the students stop saying, well, what was that word? So my mother graduated from high school. My father took college while he was working at Merrill Lynch at Queens College. So really, no one from my high school, no one went from high school to college in my generation. So I was this kind of first generation of students. So I really didn't know a whole lot at all about the college process. And if you've looked long enough, you could probably see me here. That's my kindergarten picture I found. So that's my public school 232. Okay, so here's some more general information. So New York public schools, right? So this influenced me throughout my lifetime in ways that I have no idea, but I've pulled out a few while thinking about it. So New York public schools, large diversity, right? You know, we talk about diversity issues in 2021. For me, growing up in New York City, you just look to the left and look to the right of you, and that was diversity because that's what it was, right? I'd not really known about things associated with diversity because it was all that. And also we had no grass, right? There was blacktops, there was dirt, we never had any grass. And then in 4th grade, I moved out to Long Island. And, 60 miles from Queens, there was very limited diversity, and there was grass everywhere. So I really had this kind of a change when I was in 4th grade. My high school had 1,600 graduating students, if you can believe that. So the school had about 6,000 students. Our catalog for classes was like a community college. It was that big. So imagine going to a school, right, that's much, much larger than many colleges. So that was my graduating class. Lots of opportunity, easy to get lost. So one of the things that impacted me throughout my career was the opportunity to give people an opportunity to get an at-bat. So what do I mean by that? So I tried out for the baseball team, and the first day we did fielding, and I fielded the ball with all the others. And then the next day it rained, and so we didn't get the opportunity to hit. And then the day after that, they announced who was going to be on the team. And the people that I guess they already knew who they wanted to be on the team were on the team. And I always thought, I never really got the opportunity to get my at-bat. And throughout my career, I always was frustrated by that because, you never got the opportunity. And so for me, I think that opportunity and equity is kind of embedded in things I think about. So, and there's me again in 5th grade. Okay, so career pathway, undergraduate college choice. So my father was in the Navy, as you saw a picture, and so I ended up applying for and getting this sort of alternate ROTC scholarship. And so the Navy was going to pay for my schooling. Of course, it was an alternate scholarship, so the first semester I had to spend on campus, and then I could be offered a full scholarship. And so I thought, well, if Navy's paying, why not go to an expensive private school, right? So I applied to Rochester and Rensselaer and Boston. I got into all of those, and I selected University of Rochester. And while doing this, I found even the letter that I got. I can't believe I keep all these things, but there it is. There's the letter. And so mid-August 1987, I am preparing for my life in the ROTC and ultimately in the Navy. And while I'm preparing, I notice that I'm slowing down while I'm training. So I'm doing a lot of running, and then I'm getting slower and slower, which really shouldn't happen when you're training. So eventually I go to the doctors, and I'm diagnosed with mononucleosis and something else that I forget. And so Rochester says, hey, you can't come up to school if you have mono and whatever was else I had. And of course, the Navy's like, you need to start out at school in order for us to put you in that program. So while I convalesced for those 2 months, I wondered what to do through September, through October, through November. I had also applied to State University of New York at Buffalo, right? Because it was the only state school at the time that had chemical engineering. And so I started at Buffalo in the spring of 1988. I must have deferred my admission till then. So I started at UB in the spring of 1988. My first course was in Capon Hall, MEB with Dr. Kofke. I don't know if he remembers that, but that was the first course. And so today I teach MEB, and if I was in Akron today, I would have taught MEB. So I'm teaching the first class that I was in. I found an internship during my junior year, thanks to Dr. Monsiaris with Union Carbide in Seadrift, Texas. And that's an interesting story I can tell, but it takes a long time. But if you ever want to hear it, you can. Then I joined the Navy Nuclear Propulsion Officer Candidate Program during my senior year. And I even did an undergraduate research project with Dr. Lund in his lab. So I want to talk about some pivotal experiences, right? Because, I think all of you can think back to a few pivotal experiences that kind of changed the trajectory of your career and your life. So one was being a math anxiety tutor in the math place. So I was walking down the hallway. I want to say, is there a library? Is it called like Lakewood or something like that? Or say again? Lockwood, thank you. Okay, so I was walking down that hallway and I saw a poster on the wall for being a tutor. And so I said, wow, that's something that I want to explore, I'm interested in. So I tutored for credit and for pay for 5 semesters at this math place, which, by the way, still exists, and I pulled this off the website the other day. I enjoyed helping people learn challenging concepts. So, for me, I took a lot out of that experience, right? So you're working with someone that is struggling, and then you provide them a pathway to understand, and they get a lot of joy out of it. And I felt like I got even more joy out of it. So it was very personally rewarding for me, that experience in the math place, that I just happened to see a flyer for walking between 2 buildings. Okay, so another pivotal conversation. Here's my graduation picture. So I served as National Society for Professional Engineering president during my senior year. There's a story associated with that. There's not many chemical engineers that are involved in NSPE. Be that as it may, I drove back from a meeting with another officer, and we ended up sharing next steps in our career. And so I spoke about I was going to go into the Navy, NUPOC program. And then she said, well, I'm staying at UB for grad school. And so I scratched my head, because up to that point, I didn't know anyone that had ever been to graduate school beyond the TAs and the faculty. So no one in my family, none of the friends I had were thinking about graduate school. I knew nothing about that. So really, it was very, very far from my thoughts. And so that's kind of a message to, I think, maybe the whole group here. This was my background, and I went through this program, and I had never even thought about graduate school as an option. Heck, I even had an undergraduate research experience, but graduate school was really something I never saw myself doing. So career path, Navy and beyond. So I was in the Navy for 3 years, and I left the Navy in July after 3 years, and I started looking for a job. And of course, if you had to pick a bad time to look for a job, it would be like during the summer, because all of those like entry-level positions have already been taken for those that graduated at the end of the spring semester. So after several interviews that I went on in the fall, but no offers, I decided to use the resources as UB as an alumnus. So there I am living in New York on my brother's couch, and I decided to drive up to Buffalo and use their, I don't know what it was called then, but now it's called the Career Design Center, and it was in Cape and Hall. And they had jobs available. There was something called a resume expert. Basically, I was going to use the resources that are available as an alum, which is actually still available. So as an alumnus, you can certainly use that. Okay, so this is where you have to ask your question, is this serendipity or is this fate? So here's me, right? I'm walking, and I see the Career Center. This is in the hallway up by Cape and what's ever next to Cape. I could literally see the Career Center. And so a colleague of mine that was graduated with me, Jim Uhich, he turns the corner, and he and I almost run into each other. Right? And so here's a guy I hadn't seen in 3 years, and I drive up on a certain day, and I run into him, literally run into him. And so I ask him, hey, Jim, what are you doing here? He's like, oh, I'm going to graduate school. Jim is a local guy. He graduated from Sweet Home High School. And so I asked him about, well, how do you afford to pay for it? Because that was a topic he and I had often spoke about. He's like, oh, I'm a paid TARA. So I'm thinking, oh, okay, paid TARA, all that money is going towards tuition. He's like, no, there's a tuition waiver. And so for me, it was like, what? How does this even exist? So what do I do? Well, I started to think that night. Right? So I went and I used the Career Center, wrote down a bunch of things, and I started to think. So I enjoyed school and learning. I liked teaching, right? So I was thinking back to my math place experience. I always felt like I was drinking from a fire hose, and the reality is that it's still like that everywhere, right? The undergraduate engineering curriculum's got a lot of material in it, but I was good at school. could I become a faculty member and teach others? Well, if so, I needed to get my PhD. And so I met, I think the next day, I don't know if Dr. Lund is here, if he even remembers this conversation, but obviously it was a big impact on me. So he said that I should apply and I'd be welcomed at UB. I was one of their undergraduate students. But I had to meet with Dr. Slovacek, Dr. Yang, and Dr. Ruckenstein first and talk to them about an opportunity and opportunities in their lab. And actually, it's very interesting to go meet with each of them and talk about those opportunities. So I spoke with my fiance, and within 2 months, we were driving up to Buffalo. It was a snowstorm. I remember the day we left. And I started my PhD. And so now I'm off to the academic career part of my story. So, what's next after my PhD? So postdoc versus assistant professor, various interviews. So, I did my career. What do I do after that, right? So I finished my PhD, and my wife is asking, I followed you through the Navy. Okay, I went up to Buffalo for you. You're going to start your career. You're going to go, postdoc is like delaying your opportunities to get into your faculty career. And so I kind of made that decision. I took various interviews, and I started at Tennessee Tech. And Tennessee Tech, it was a decision because I made it over some other offers because of a conversation I had with Dr. Ellie Ruckenstein. And he said something to the order of, well, you could be a small fish in a big pond, right? So you join a large department, you're seen, you're hardly ever heard, you don't really have any influence, or you could be a big fish in a small pond. You join a small program, you can have a big impact. And I said, you know what, I want to be this person here. And so Tennessee Tech was the place I chose. It had a small program. At the time, it had 6 faculty. It had a PhD program. Focus on undergraduate education, but graduate efforts were crucial. So that was important to me because I had this focus on undergraduate, but there was a master's program, there was a PhD program, et cetera. I didn't have a starter package. So, I obviously wouldn't recommend that to people, but I ended up getting a new chair, right? What does that mean? I got it from, I think I bought it from Staples or someplace like that. Got a new computer, and basically said good luck. And so I needed to find funding to support my graduate students and research, and so I sent out, lots of cold calls to national labs, et cetera, et cetera. So I did the things I needed to do. I had to hustle to do the things I needed to do to kind of start my career. So I want to go through some of my academic appointments. So I was an assistant professor, associate professor, and professor at Tennessee Tech from 1999 to 2010. Some of those, by the way, those cold emails I'd mentioned sending out worked out, so I ended up spending a couple of years in a summer program at Cyndia National Labs. And so that kind of worked out for me because it provided a direction from a research perspective and also opportunities to support students. So I was undergraduate program coordinator from 2003 to 2008. So this is an opportunity where we had a new department chair, and the person asked if I wanted to have this particular opportunity. And I knew it was something that I was interested in, but is it something you take on being a tenure track faculty member and assistant professor? But if I knew I wanted to have an influence and get that experience, this is an opportunity to do it. So I was undergraduate program coordinator for 5 years and graduate program coordinator, and then I was made associate dean for a year. And I was also identified as the inaugural Tennessee Tech Distinguished Faculty Fellow in 2008. And so I left Tennessee Tech and I moved to the University of Akron, and I became Associate Dean for Undergraduate Affairs. And the reason why I was Associate Dean for Undergraduate Affairs is because I was credible as someone who had gone through and volunteered to be this program coordinator at the undergraduate level and graduate level. So I did the things I needed to do in my career to be able to be credible in this particular way. So I served in that capacity for 5 years. I ended up as interim dean for a year, and then we had a dean search, and I was dean for a year within the college. And so I am now faculty member, a professor within the department. Okay, some career highlights and metrics. A variety of refereed journal publications, conference proceedings, book chapters, an undergraduate textbook, contributions to a variety of presentations, grant dollars, advised PhD students and undergraduate research students. This kind of gives you, kind of a flavor for some of the experiences I've had, and then these are some of the metrics. So there's a variety of service highlights. At the national level, and you can kind of read them there. This one I'm kind of excited about, being a chair of the ASE Faculty Teaching Excellence Task Force. My hope is that all of you in this room over the course of the next year or two will hear a little bit more about that particular national effort, something that's very close to me. And I'm editor of the Journal of Chemical Engineering Education. Awards and honors, and you can see some of those here. And a variety of things throughout my career. I think that for me, and you'll see this in a bit, there's kind of a research award there, and then there's a teaching award there, and I kind of see both of those as part of my job, and obviously service as the third part. And then, of course, being here today is something that's very important to me. So Mark asked me when he emailed me about this. One of the questions was, kind of why did you end up taking this particular pathway? And so why did I become a professor? So I wanted to teach others, right? So that came from my math place experience. And then what about the research aspect, right? So how does the research fit in? Because there's places where you can go and just become a teacher and not really get involved with the research aspect. So I see an engineer as a creative problem solver who solves problems through design. And when I think about a research problem, so when Ted presented his research this afternoon, and he talked about his 2 research problems, I loved that. That, you put that in terms of a research problem, because that's really, so here's a research problem from a technical standpoint, right? Design a solution pathway to solve, whether that's the design of corrosion inhibitors to extend workable life of reinforced concrete, or the design of a program that retains more freshman students in engineering through the use of social cognitive career theory, right? And so I work on both of those. It's an NSF-funded project there. So I see it both as solving research problems, one in technical area, one in this more educational area. Okay, so what about the administrative pathway? I kind of mentioned sort of my experiences made me competitive for that associate dean position, but why was I interested in it? Well, I had this experiences through this undergraduate program coordinator, and it was just at this kind of small level. And I thought to myself, can I take this small level and extend it to beyond, and solve larger, more interesting problems? So an example of a smaller problem is that at Tennessee Tech, when the students came into our program as freshmen, we never saw them. And so they would spend a year in this basic engineering sort of program. And then we would see them sophomore years. The first class was material energy balances in the fall. But by the time they were on campus for a year, we had lost, 20%, 25, 30% of them to another major within the university, or they left the university, et cetera. And as the undergraduate program coordinator, I was frustrated by that. And so what we ended up doing is we ended up carving out a credit hour within our curriculum to design an introduction to chemical engineering 1 credit hour course that catered to kind of more of the social, emotional aspects of students. And this is probably 2005 or 2006. And so it was a 1 credit hour class that met twice a week, and it really kind of allowed us to engage this cohort as soon as they came on campus. And so for me, that's an example of, hey, this is an idea locally within my department. Can I expand ideas like that within the college and even beyond the college? So that's kind of the administrative pathway. So if you find during your career, if you take an academic pathway, that you like solving those sorts of larger problems, then an administrative pathway may be for you. Okay, so when I was in the Navy, specifically at nuclear power school, there were two sorts of instructors. One of the instructors would be those that had their bachelor's degree in engineering or bachelor's degree in physics or chemistry. And then they would teach us sort of, steam propulsion, nuclear reactor stuff from basically a kind of a basic science perspective that was focused on the things we were supposed to learn. So there was physics, there was math, there was chemistry, etc. And so those were taught by these sort of bachelor's degrees in science and engineering. And then we had operations courses. And those were taught by sea returnees. And the sea returnees were lieutenants that came back to do their shore leave or their shore duty after their sea duty. And, they would start talking about operations, and then we would get them to talk about stories about what they did, on the job. And for us, we were kind of vicariously having their experiences based on what they told us. And, we love that, right? And so what I'm going to do today is tell a little bit of the sea returnee stories to the graduate students. I'm sure that the faculty can kind of appreciate some of those or see themselves in some of those, and maybe a couple of lessons I've learned through each of those. Okay, so this is the anecdote. So this is the one in the hotel room, right? And so I'm borrowing from what friends would do and how they name some things. And those little things in the parentheses are to remind me while I'm doing this presentation. So I was about 1998 at AICHE meeting, submitted my application to a bunch of places, got some interviews at the conference, right? So the conference coming up in Boston very soon. I forget exactly where this one was. So this one institution or department wanted to interview me in the hotel room within the conference. Okay, so I go there, and they are seated in a room, and they're on these like high sort of bar chairs. And there's two gentlemen, they're seated on high bar chairs, and I am seated on a couch that's kind of very small. And they are up there, and I swear they must have had the room thermostat set at like 85. Because I'm just getting peppered back and forth with these questions. And I remember them asking very specifics, not only about the funding agency, but the program within the funding agency where I am going to submit my grants to, et cetera. So they asked very specific questions. And when I left the meeting, I was, I kind of was thrown off by it because it wasn't what I expected. And even in retrospect, they probably could have done things differently. But now I have the value and the perspective from my experience to really know what they were looking at. They wanted to be confident with the person that they were going to hire. And what gives people confidence? Well, a detailed plan makes people confident. So they were saying, hey, we want this person to come in, has all their plan together, so we don't have to worry about that, right? So if you have your plan together, you're well down the line. So the advice I give to those planning is think about all of those specifics, right? Where are you going to, not only what foundation, what particular program in it. The more you can do up front, the more plan you have, the more confident the committee is going to have that, hey, you're going to do this. Okay, so the one where I didn't know what I didn't know, and I'm going to give a shout out to Rowan here because, when I was a graduate student, I formed an ASE, American Society for Engineering Education, student chapter here at the University at Buffalo. And I was interested in teaching. When I was a graduate student, I had the opportunity to even teach a course here while I was a graduate student. And so I thought, wow, I'm going to, should I apply to Rowan, this school that is teaching focused? They became Rowan not too long, or rather not too much before this. And I figured, okay, well, I'll give them a shot, right? Do I really want to go to Rowan? Well, I'll apply, and of course I'm going to get an interview, and then I'll have to make a decision about whether I'm going to go there. And of course what happened is, I never heard from them. And so I kind of learned I was the fish, right, in the sense that I didn't know what I was talking about related to engineering education, and they all did, and I didn't demonstrate that at all in my application to them. I just thought my experiences were going to be enough, and they were just going to grab me up. So that was really a kind of a wake-up for me, because every program has their culture and their strengths that they're proud of. And so you don't want to underestimate or kind of look down on those particular programs. And so certainly that was my fault there. So I was a year into my career, and I went to a conference, American Society for Engineering Education conference, after a year. And it's during the summer. I forget exactly where it was, but I was talking to two colleagues that I hadn't really met before. They were in the college, but they were not in my department. And so we talked for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, like you would do at a conference. You just kind of talk and learn about people. And they started to badmouth the new dean. Okay, so they started to badmouth this new dean. And for me, they were saying, hey, Don, what do you think? What do you think about that? And, you want to be part of the team, right? You want to be included. So there was a part of me that was going to say, oh, yeah, of course, da-da-da-da. But then, I don't know, there was something on my shoulder that said, well, this is a trap. And so I said, no, really my experiences were with this person were fine. I really haven't had your experiences. And they were like, oh, okay. And so, that would have been a poor career decision for me to do something like that. It would have impacted me negatively in ways I would have never known, or I would still not know. So that's the story. And so the lesson is be careful what you say and write. You never know where your emails go. You never know what your offhand comments to colleagues, where that goes as well. So, you really have to be sensitive and be careful about that. So I had worked at Allied Signal during my career here as a graduate student, and so I was lucky enough to get some funding from Allied Signal during my first few years at Tennessee Tech. And I was filling this out, and I get to a part that says release time on the budget. And I said, release time? I said, hey, release time, what is this? What should I put there? And he says, oh, just put $10,000 each year in there. Okay, so I put then, they award it, and about a year or so later, I'm talking to a colleague, and he mentions release time, and he tells me he's been released out of his class because he has release time and some grants. I was like, oh, so that's what release time is for. The message to me was that the release time was being used to kind of fill in some aspect of the departmental budget that wasn't covered in another way. The takeaway message for me is I need to know everything that's in my budget, and so I always do all my budgets. I do my budget for all my grants, and then I send it to the Office of Sponsored Research, and I say, hey, can you check this? Did I get the fringe rate right? All of that stuff. So I would tell you now, learn budgeting and learn how to complete a budget if you go into an academic career. Really think about what should be in all of those lines. So the one with the PK. So I ended up getting a PCASE award, and I was the first one in the state of Tennessee to get one. And so I get this letter, and I go, and I'm proud and happy, and I go and I talk to the dean, and I give the dean the letter, and he looks at the letter, and he reads it, and he gives it back to me. He's like, oh, congratulations. And so I leave, and I thought, man, that was a very muted response for something as important as this within my career. And I thought about that for many years, and in retrospect, the PCASE award didn't have any indirect costs in it. Yeah, that's the laugh, right? So it didn't. And so from his perspective, he's like, okay, well, basically we're going to have to pay for all this expenditures through some of the other ways. And so he was, yeah, he was excited about it, but it was just, something else for him. But for me, I didn't understand his lack of enthusiasm. So, the take-home message from that aspect is you really have to think about how other people, from their perspectives, are viewing what you're doing. So here's one that, to me, was always sad. I had a colleague that won a career award early on in his career. And then 5, 6 years later or so, I go to visit that person. I'm giving a seminar. It's a Monday. And I go, and that person's on the list of people I need to speak to. So I go and speak to him, and I sit down and I said, hey, how are you doing? Oh, okay. And I think, well, hey, I know you're on a great path towards tenure. You must have gotten tenure already, right? And he's like, no, I just found out Friday I didn't get tenure. Right, so that was at the beginning of our 30-minute meeting, by the way. So the take-home message was kind of, what have you done for me lately? So the reality is he got his career award early in his career, and then he really didn't progress. And so when it got time to tenure, it was, well, what have you done for me lately, right? We need to see a trajectory when we go through that tenure part. And so he didn't have the trajectory. So for me, that was a learning experience about, what kind of have you done for me lately as you go through your career. The one without tenure, so I was thinking of, about moving after I got tenure, and I interviewed at a place, and they made me an offer, and then they said, well, the offer is without tenure. And I said, wait, I earned tenure. How come it can't be with tenure? They said, well, the provost has made a decision that none of our new offers, anyone we bring in, is not going to have tenure. You have to spend a couple of years getting tenure because you're not, we didn't offer you tenure, so we have to evaluate you. And I said, well, okay, let me talk to the provost because this sounds weird. So spoke to the provost a few times, and basically he was trying to convince me that I should transfer there because don't worry, you'll get tenure, no problem. It'll just take a couple of years, but you'll get tenure, no problem. And he wouldn't budge, and I wouldn't budge, and so I didn't move. And so, the advice is, if you have tenure, take it with you, right? So I would be very, very wary about going to a place that doesn't honor that tenure. So the one with Coupa, this is the college and universities, I think professional association, whatever it is, it defines dollar amounts. And so when I transferred to Akron, when they made the offer, they gave me a number, and they told me the words, oh, you're getting 50% of whatever, or something where you're getting the median level for your position according to Coupa. And so, okay, how many, in life you don't really have a lot of leverage at many times, but this time I did. They had already went through this whole hiring process. They hired me. We were now negotiating. It's a big deal to hire someone, especially from a, kind of an associate dean perspective, because you had to interview with a lot of people. And so I checked the Coupa markings, and it was several thousands of dollars different from what they offered to me from what the Coupa had said. And so I kind of took my shot, and I said, well, you said this, but this was the number here. Help me understand why those are different. And it ended up where they apologized for kind of doing that and then said, oh, yeah, this is the number you should be getting. And so it was an opportunity to negotiate. So the takeaway is when you have leverage, use it wisely within limits because you're only going to have it a few times within your career. So the one where I became a dean, so we had a series of kind of acting/interim deans in our college. And so the last one had left because he was also the dean of our polymer school. And so myself and another person decided that we were going to interview for the interim dean position. And so the provost said, sure, both of you guys come by, one at 2, one at 2:30. And, oh, do we have to prepare anything? No, just come by, we'll have a conversation. So that was the feedback that both of us were given. So the person goes in front of me at 2 o'clock, and they have their conversation. I don't know what they talked about. So I came in at 2:30, and I knew it was not going to be a conversation, or if it was going to be a conversation, it was going to be the conversation I wanted to have. And so I prepared specifically what I was going to do. So I had all these things, and I basically drove the conversation on what I was going to do in this interim position. I had all these things worked out, and my guess is that the other person didn't. And so the lesson there is be prepared to take your shot. So even though, what's the comment about, you underpromise and you overperform, right? So this particular opportunity was for me to be able to demonstrate that I was going to overperform for him. I have already a lesson learned. So this is kind of the last sort of anecdote, and I'm going to, it's probably, this is the last anecdote, and this is one of my last slides. But so when we would have faculty candidates interview for positions, they would interview with the dean, and I was the dean for 2 years. And we had, at that point, we had many faculty openings within the college. So we would have people come in and interview, and I would talk with them for half an hour. And maybe the first 15 minutes we talk about what they're going to do from a research perspective, da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. And then I'd start asking questions about teaching. And so I said, hey, you gave me this 20, 30-page research plan. It had all these references. It had the plan of where you're going to get funding. That's great. But your teaching statement is 1 page, and it's going to say what you're going to do. And how come there's no references? How come there's no context within the previous research? And so it didn't matter where that person was from, you got this kind of jaw dropping. Because I had kind of caught them out because they hadn't thought about it. And so it would always give me the opportunity then to go to my bookshelf and pull things out and say, this is the literature in the field of this other part of the job that you're applying for. Right? I'm not going to talk about service, but teaching and research, yeah, you're fantastic in the research, but where have you prepared for the teaching? And why haven't you been preparing for that? And so for me, it was kind of an opportunity on an individual basis to talk to them about that. So the lesson learned is be a professional in all aspects of your career, teaching, research, and service. So here's some of my last thoughts, takeaway message. Right? So there's 160 or so programs in chemical engineering within the US. Each has its own culture. Find the culture that will work for you. Right? And so how do you do that? Well, ask questions during your interview. Ask questions of colleagues that know about that program. Do your research. Right? Read what's going on within the department. So those are the things that you can do to find the culture that's right for you, or at least one you think you can survive and thrive in. So you read journal articles, attend classes, kind of just what I emphasized before. You go to workshops, you attend conferences, you speak with colleagues and experts, all related to master the technical aspects of your career. And the question is, why aren't you doing something similar for the educational aspects of your potential your future career? And so that's available to you in the same way that it is in the technical area. So, I strongly encourage you to do that as you move forward if you haven't. Okay, so at that I want to thank you all for your attention this afternoon. And this is me, by the way, about 1992, Ooze Fest. I think they still have that here. It's like this mud volleyball thing. And then, I'm a two-time alum. So the Bulls were in Akron last weekend, and they had a big win. And, of course, I was at the game. So thank you all, and I'm happy to take any questions from anyone.
Right. Thank you, Don, for a very enlightening talk. Happy to have some students ask some questions.
Sure. Okay, so for 3 years in the Navy, and after that I became a graduate student. And the first class I took was statistical mechanics, and it was that Macquarie textbook. And so it was a big transition for me because it had been 3 years to do that, especially in the Navy. So one of the things I remember is, walking down the hallway, and students would be like sitting on the floors. And that always I'm like, wait, you can't sit on the floors, right? Imagine if you were in the Navy and they did that, right? So that experience influenced me. As far as, going to graduate school right after undergraduate, yeah, it's easier. It really is, and it was a challenge to get back to that. So, there is some value, and certainly there's people among the faculty here that have gotten their bachelor's degree, went out to industry, and then came back to get their PhDs, and it does happen. But yeah, it was a challenge to do that, absolutely.
What were the challenges involved when you moved from being a graduate student to advising graduate students?
Okay, the challenge from being a graduate student to advising graduate students. So one of the things that I had to, I struggled to impart to the students is that it was their project. So how do I transition them from having them work for me as opposed to I'm advising on their project? And so that was a struggle. It was a struggle for them. It was a struggle for me to come up with ways to do that effectively. So for me, that was a big challenge because once they start to take ownership in things, then they're off. If not, then it was a challenge to transition people from that. Right? Some people are born in that way. Heck, there's high school students or undergraduate students you interact with, and they're coming to you with great ideas, right? It's just that, I struggled with the transition to motivate people that were in the graduate program to take ownership of the project. For me, that was probably the biggest transition. From a graduate perspective, you always have to be hustling, right? You're always writing proposals and writing the next paper and things like that. So that's certainly a challenge. How can you do all of that, right? So the faculty life, there's a lot going on. So when I started, I didn't know. This is how naive I was. I didn't know if you would punch a clock or not, right? I didn't know what were my hours. So I remember showing up on the first day, and I'm leaning against the door frame. It was the early August, and the department chair thought I was a graduate student looking for funding, like a new graduate student. And I'm thinking, no, I'm the guy you just hired a couple of months ago, right? So, I didn't know what the hours were, right? And so the reality is, you know what the hours are? It's 24/7. That's the sort of job you're at. And when I was in the Navy, it wasn't like that. You went to work and you did your work, and then you came home and it was separate. And so the transition from, the graduate student, then becoming a faculty, and you were working all the time, and I was like, oh, this is kind of just like being a graduate student, right? And so, it was a struggle to figure out the hours. It was a struggle to understand how much time to put towards my research, how much time to put towards my teaching. I remember in my first year, and so, I was kind of focused on trying to do a good job as an educator, and I got really bad evaluations. And the evaluations said things like, Dr. Visco is never in his office. Dr. Visco thinks that research is the most important thing, and he doesn't care about our education. Here's the thing that hurts the most that they said to me. A teaching assistant would be better and cheaper. Right? And so imagine reading that after your first year, and you're sitting there like, am I in the wrong career? And so, but there's two things you could do, right? One thing is what do they know, right? And I've read many, many, many evaluations as, associate dean and dean, and I know that there are faculty that feel that way. What do they know, right? Even though they're the consumers of the product, right, that you're presenting to them. The other part is, okay, how do I get better? Right? And so I didn't know how to get better. And that's when I went really to the ASCE summer school, which, by the way, is next summer in Colorado School of Mines. That's when I learned that there's this community that, that's available to me, and that's where I kind of then ended up. Basically, I ended up being very proactive in some of the things that I did. So, I ended up moving my office hours into a classroom because students were sometimes fearful to go in and see the professor. There were things I did that were very proactive from a student perspective. So, that was a challenge as well.
I'm going to ask a question, but I'll let you ask a question next, I promise. So, you came in as a grad student, you're told you have to go meet with Ralph Yang and Vladimir Lachek and Oliver Gutstein. Then what happened? Like, you didn't...
So,
You didn't work for one of those National Academy members.
no, I didn't, actually. So I met with all of them, and they were each interesting in their own way. I remember sitting in Dr. Slovacek's office. I remember sitting at his long table, and he explained to me his research. I remember speaking with Ellie Ruckenstein and you know, his Spartan sort of office, right? And with the one poster, right, on it. And then speaking with Ralph Yang in his office. So I ended up, you know, not making that particular decision to do that. I don't know who else I spoke to, but I ended up speaking with Dave Kofke, and I don't know if you remember this, but you were very excited that I was talking to you, at least the impression I got, that I was talking to you about this, about wanting to or at least listening to, you know, your pitch about what you did in the program. And so, you know, my first thought was, thermodynamics, you know, like, really, you know, because
Assistant professor, you might not get tenure.
At that point, I didn't know the difference between, I didn't know what tenure was, I didn't know assistant, right? I'm just this graduate student that just made a decision very quickly to start grad school. So yeah, I didn't know anything from anything at that point. But you know, I came to love certainly thermo and love its power. But you know, certainly owe so much to Dave and his patience with me as a, you know, graduate student, you know, knocking on his door and you know, having him answer, you know, any of the millions of questions I asked him over the years, even today.
You have one back there?
Yeah, I was going to ask you the question, like, considering where you are right now and everything, you've been going to graduate school, and Interim was like a good choice for you?
You're saying like in retrospect, was it?
Yeah, from your standpoint right now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't, it would be hard to imagine my career any other way, but the reality is that it could have been, right? If Occidental Chemical would have made me that offer in Philadelphia, right? Would I have been working there, you know, right now? So I think the things work out the way they should be. You know, look, I ran into Jim Uhich randomly, right? So how, that little example I gave, how did that happen, right? Where if I was stopped at a stoplight for like 30 seconds more, I would have missed him. And I wouldn't have known any of that about, you know, graduate school. And, you know, I was probably told about that when I was an undergraduate, but I wasn't ready to listen. So, you know, many times as faculty, you know, we tell things to students and they don't hear it. And like, well, I told you that last year or 2 years ago. You weren't ready to listen, right? That just kind of went one ear and out the other. I'm sure I heard it, but I wasn't ready to listen. And at that point, apparently I was ready to listen. So, you know, the world did things to kind of put that in my way. So, yeah, I think I was probably destined then to be a faculty member.
Thank you. That's part of the interesting sharing with the anecdotes. So what is the most challenging aspect in your job search after you graduated?
The most challenging part of the search.
During your searching for positions.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, I would say today you're much more competitive with a postdoc because, you know, you're comparing, as a postdoc with 1 or 2 years experience, you probably have written grant or grants, maybe you've even gotten a grant. And so you're comparing that with someone, and then maybe you've even published a bunch more papers as a postdoc, and you're comparing that with someone else that didn't have that. So even, you know, when it was however many years ago, I think, you know, I didn't have the postdoc, and so I think that was a challenge for me. So, you know, I think even today it's probably even more of a, depending on where you want to go, right? So if you're saying, you know, I really want to go to a place like, you know, like Rowan, right? So have I done the things during my career to get me to that place? So it really depends upon where you want to go. So you have to make sure you identify the culture of the place, and then have you done the things to make yourself competitive in that way? Yeah.
So I just want to point out, Don, I really enjoyed the talk and learning even more about you than I knew already. It's really very fascinating. I just want to say I absolutely do remember you being in that material and entry balances class. It was the very first class that I ever taught, so it's really stuck on my mind. I know many of the students who were there, Jim Yugich, for example, I remember him as well. One thing that strikes me, I guess, is that there were at least 2 students I know of now who ended up who were in that class and ended up being a dean of engineering. And I'm wondering, are you sure there wasn't something I did?
I'll have to think about that. Oh yeah, I know who you're talking. Yeah, Dave. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Is there another? Sure, go ahead.
So, as an undergraduate student, how do you suggest that we build the right relationship with professors in order to get research opportunities and experiences outside of classroom?
So from the undergraduate student perspective, so when students ask me about that, right? So there's part of it where the undergraduate student has some responsibility to do that research and find out what each professor is doing, right? So there's detailed websites, and then so you find out what they're doing, and then you set up, I think it's the first contact, right? Email or whatever it is, and I think there's that contact explaining that you've read the website or you've read this information, and you're interested in learning more about it. Do you have opportunities in the group? Is there opportunity to talk about it? That's the strategy, because professors, right, any researcher, if people are interested in what they're doing, they can talk about it for any length of time, right? Because we're used to doing that because, heck, we do it every day in the classroom, right? So we're used to talking about things for extended periods of time. So if you approach someone and identify that you have an interest in that particular topic, I don't want to say in every situation, but in most situations they're going to speak to you about those opportunities because you're interested in what they're doing. And so I think the onus is a little bit on the undergraduate student to make that first contact. For me as a faculty member, what I do, right? So I teach the sophomore level class, and I grade the exams. I know who's really good in the class, and so, I think we all do it, right? You find those, and maybe you write that little note on the exam. Hey, maybe see me about, or you contact them after the class. Right? You did really fantastic. You ever thought about doing research, undergraduate research? If you do, I'll talk to you about it. So the faculty will take an interest in certain students, depending on how they perform. But the students can be proactive in contacting the faculty directly. So does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to wrap things up. Don will be around, probably being forced to judge posters like the rest of us, or having the privilege of judging posters like the rest of us. And I'm sure you can talk to him. Before everybody stands up, we've got to do the presentation of the Crystal Buffaloes. Whenever anyone gives a named talk here, they are presented with a lovely Crystal Buffalo symbol for displaying on your bookshelf. And if the student speakers could come back up, Ted and Pihu.
Wow, fantastic.
As PhD students, they get another one of these when they graduate, and then they have bookends.
Am I moving out of the way here?
Well, I think eventually there's going to be a group photo
Sure.
or something, and Ted with the buffalo. And Pihu with the buffalo. Up here? Thanks, everybody. See you out there at the posters. I think it's safe for you all to leave.